Just before noon on the 21st of October 1805, Admiral Viscount Horatio Nelson stood aboard the deck of his flagship HMS Victory. A light wester-1 wind whistled through the air, and in the distance he could see the frigates of the Franco-Spanish fleet. For weeks he had bided his time, patiently waiting, reviewing tactics and planning every action down to the finest detail. Now, finally the hour had come, and he signaled Lottie's fleet to begin the attack. In less than 5 hours, he would experience a victory that would define his life, and a loss that would end it. Today Nelson is remembered as one of Britain's greatest heroes, a warrior, a commander and a victor. However, when he entered this world on the 29th of September 1758, the sixth of 11 children, he was a sickly baby. His parents were so fearful that he would not survive that they had him baptized early. This occurrence would begin a lifelong tradition of battling and succeeding against the odds. The Nelson family were not unknown, but they certainly weren't particularly wealthy, and they had to exploit their connections to ensure a steady future for their children. Nelson's mother, Catherine Suckling, was a distant relative of Robert Walpole, first Prime Minister of Great Britain. However, tragically, Nelson's mother died when the boy was just 9. It was to be his maternal uncle who would have the biggest influence on his life. As aged just 12, Nelson began his naval career serving under his uncle, Captain Maurice Suckling, on the HMS Victory. When Nelson joined the Navy, it was in the lowest ranks. However, perhaps the result of being a sixth child in a large family, he sought glory above all else. This quest to make a name for himself and achieve renown fueled a work ethic that soon impressed his superiors and saw him ascend through the ranks at a rapid rate. This was particularly impressive for a boy who suffered iron extreme seasickness. After crossing the Atlantic several times, Nelson, eager to experience as much as possible, obtained a position on HMS Carcass. The ship was set on an expedition across the Arctic to find the fabled Northwest Passage to India. This was a very perilous mission, and was ultimately unsuccessful, with the ship forced to turn back. However, along the way, an eager 15-year-old Nelson decided to pursue a polar bear across the ice. Young, intrepid and fearless, thanks to a sudden crack in the ice separating the beast from Nelson, the headstrong boy was granted another last-minute escape from likely death. The eager young sailor saw his first action when he was stationed aboard Seahorse in the East Indies. It was only a brief exchange of volleys, but Nelson was gaining experience and watching carefully. He was a fast learner and had a quick mind for naval tactics, so when a case of malaria caused him to be discharged, it affected him badly. While recovering, Nelson faced another battle, but this time with depression. For someone so determined to prove their worth and make a name for themselves, coming so close to a death of relative obscurity was a difficult pill to swallow. However, his proud, optimistic spirit won through, and fueled by patriotism and renewed determination, Nelson passed the lieutenant exam and set sail again, this time into the perilous heart of the War of American Independence. Aged just 20, was Nelson given command of a frigate and experienced his first taste of command, attacking Spanish settlements in Nicaragua. The operation was a success, and Nelson was commended for his quick thinking and valiant actions. However, this success did not last, as almost the entire British force was struck down with yellow fever. Nelson himself barely recovered with his life. And when he returned to sea in 1784, it was not to a life for daring battles and valiant successes. Instead, Nelson's role was to enforce the Navigation Act. He made many enemies, and the loneliness of command saw him sink back into despair and depression. When he returned home, he found himself unpopular with his kinsmen, without any appointment, and unemployed for 5 long years. Nelson was battered and bruised. But he was not defeated. His marriage to the widow Frances Nispet, who had a 5-year-old son, revitalized a man who was already fat older than his 29 years. Meanwhile, overseas, events were happening that would affect the path his life would take forever. The people of France were rebelling. The king had been killed, the world was watching, and finally, Nelson was given a ship, the 64-gun Agamemnon. At last things in Nelson's life were looking up. He had a loving wife at home, a fast, powerful ship under his command, and an able crew who listened and followed his orders. This dynamic life suited Nelson, and in it he began to flourish. The enthusiastic young man was still there, But another side was emerging. A capable commander and flashes of genius. It was during this period, while defending the port of Toulon, that Nelson first crossed swords with a 24-year-old French artillery officer by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. It was during this period of time or revolution, unrest and war that Nelson achieved some of his lesser-known but equally notable victories against the Spanish at Cap Vincent in 1797 and at the Battle of Copenhagen. The bold, intrepid commander was beginning to carve a name for himself. His men adored him because not only was he extremely capable, but he was also dating a trait that cost him the sight in his tight eye. In the British Navy he was something of a rebel, ignoring orders to withdraw. In one instance during the Battle of Copenhagen, he lifted his telescope to his blind eye, pretending not to see the command to withdraw. Nelson's force of will and bullish British spirit won him victory after victory, and although he was admired greatly as a leader, a remnant of the young man seeking affirmation and glory remained. Depression and self-doubt were demons that Nelson was doomed to fight until his final day, foes that even a million naval victories and commendations could not vanquish. Although a peace treaty had been signed with France in 1802, just a year later war broke out once again. Nelson was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet and hoisted his flag on the ship that would be forever linked with his name, HMS Victory. One's mission was to blockade Toulon to prevent French ships from meeting up with those in the Atlantic and also Spanish ships in Cadiz and Cartagena. Britain was well aware that the prize Napoleon desired most of all was invasion of their own country, and its ultimate destruction. With the combined force of these ships, that invasion was a very real possibility. If united, this single invincible fleet could take control of the Channel, enabling the French Emperor to ravage Britain and leave it in tatters. It was up to Nelson and his men to stop that happening. The French Admiral Pierre Villeneuve was a man under pressure. It was under his command that the combined fleet was to sail, and it was up to him to ensure that happened. Although Nelson and his fleet linked nearby, Villeneuve managed to sneak out of Toulon under cover of bad weather. Upon realizing the admiral had moved, Nelson set off in pursuit. The French reunited with some of their ships, but they failed to take control of the Channel, so fled south to Cadiz with their fleet. Napoleon was not pleased with Villeneuve's delay and already had plans to replace him. It was a final accusation of cowardice that forced Villeneuve to leave the harbour, and as far as he knew, there was no British force nearby that could hope to best him. Unfortunately for Villeneuve, he was wrong. When Villeneuve first made for Cadiz, Nelson had returned home, and for 25 days he had perfected his strategy. Napoleon had refocused his efforts on his Grand Army in Austria. But in England, invasion by sea still seemed a very real possibility, and Nelson was the hero who could prevent it. On the 15th of September 1805, Nelson set sail on Victory again, and was very careful to keep his main fleet well out to sea. Villeneuve had no idea that what he was running into was a strategy designed to stop him for good, and a man who still had something to prove. As the silhouettes of the combined fleet appeared against the sunrise over Cap Trafalgar, the British finally began to move. They split into two divisions, one led by Nelson and the other by Collingwood. On board Victory, Nelson ordered his lieutenant to carry a message to the fleet: England expects that every man will do his duty. Nelson was many things: curious, energetic, even reckless. His adventurous spirit and quest for personal pride had led him to travel to the furthest reaches of the world, but it had been his duty that kept him there. It was this sense of duty in the face of fear and danger that Nelson instilled in his men that day. The men had every right to be afraid. Naval tactics at the time meant that almost every battle followed a set sequence. The ships would line up against each other and attack from the broadside cannons. This strategy was such an integral part of naval warfare at the time that it had inspired the name Ship of the Line for the vessels that took part in it. But Nelson had other plans. He would deviate from the norm, and instead of facing down the line of Villeneuve's fleet in the ordinary fashion, he would attack them from the west, at right angles, in two squadrons. This put Nelson and his men at immense risk as they were exposed to the fleet's powerful and devastating broadside cannons, but if they could cut their way through, they could slice the fleet in three and destroy it. The British aligned themselves into two long lines, and like two arrows fired forward, they stormed towards the combined fleet, led by the flagships. The Franco-Spanish fleet were not expecting or prepared for such a tactic. The French ship Fort-Hughes let off a broadside towards Collingwood's Royal Sovereign as he burst through the line, but it was too late. Sovereign raked Santa Ana, the Spanish flagship, with an attack so devastating it disabled 14 guns and 400 crew members. Victory meanwhile was leading the charge towards the two ships Redoutable and Bucentaure. With the fleet so crowded together, Victory was forced to ram the ship and fire off broadsides at point-blank range. The situation was so dangerous that many had urged Nelson to conduct the battle from a safe distance, or at least remove the stats of honor gleaming on his coat. Nelson refused. He had come close to death many times before, but he was convinced that he would meet his end at Trafalgar. He had already said farewell to his friends and family, and if he was going to die, he was going to go out with his medals on his chest. French sailors in the rigging of Redoutable were already picking off men exposed on Victory's deck. Minutes before Nelson himself was shot, a man standing beside him was blown in half by a cannonball, but Nelson did not move. Whether it was for pride, bravado or courage, Nelson remained on the deck of his ship. Shortly after 1 p.m., a musket shot hit Nelson, throwing him to the deck floor and shattering his spine. Still calling out instructions to his crew, he was carried below and examined by a surgeon, who confirmed death was imminent. Despite his injuries and suffering immense pain, Nelson constantly asked for updates on the battle. Before he died, he was informed that the British fleet had taken 15 enemy ships. Nelson's dangerous tactic had worked. He knew he had won. As he drew his last breath, his beloved flag captain Hardy kissed his forehead and Nelson uttered his final words, "Now I am satisfied. Thank God, I have done my duty." Nelson had never desired a long comfortable life. He was a master of the seas and a seeker of adventure. As he left this world with the news of his greatest victory ringing in his ears, he departed it, finally, with pride. Nelson's fatal injury caused him to miss the climax of the battle, where 3 British ships battered the French flagship Bucentaure into submission. Arid Villeneuve was forced to surrender. All around British ships were tearing holes into the combined fleet, at great loss of life. The French ship Roquille refused to surrender, and was blown up with everyone on board. By the end of the battle, the British had suffered 1,666 casualties, while the combined fleet's casualties numbered near 14,000. France and Spain lost approximately 21 ships in the battle, while Britain lost none. Napoleon's plans to invade were well and truly thwarted. The victory at Trafalgar had cemented British dominance of the sea, a mastery that would go unchallenged for 10 more years of war, and more than 100 years of worldwide naval domination. However, this victory was completely overshadowed in England by the news of Nelson's death. He had been the nation's hero before he departed, and when his body was returned, he was their martyr. Nelson's body was preserved for the journey back in a cask of rum, as the Admiral had requested a land burial. He was honored with a magnificent state funeral at St. Paul's Cathedral, and his popularity soared. His image was carved into countless statues and the monuments. Streets were named after him, and his flagship was painstakingly preserved, surviving today as the oldest naval ship still in commission. Nelson's rise from a small, sickly child to the greatest and the most beloved war hero in British history is unlikely to ever be repeated. He remains a key part of British identity, and his famous column resides at the heart of the capital. The man himself has taken on an almost godlike status, a source of pride, duty and bravery. But he was also a man who was led by a desire to prove himself, who suffered with self-doubt. Perhaps this is Nelson and Britain's greatest achievement. Not a naval victory, but the willpower and bravery to sail against the winds of uncertainty and fear, and to overcome